Dali, en el momento de salir del huevo.
This is the image that people usually have of Salvador Dali, a strident, eccentric artist, fond of provocation and money. But there's another Dali behind the mask. A consummate artist who, like the Renaissance masters, aspired to merge art and science. Dali's work reflects the main scientific theories and discoveries of the 20th century. Even his signature was inspired by a scientific image.
C'est une couronne de lait, une couronne liquide basée sur la morphologie.
The liquid crown is the stroboscopic photograph of a drop of milk. The American engineer Harold Edgerton created this image in 1936. Dali employed it for the first time in 1938 and would never let it go. Science was a lifelong obsession for Dali.
Every painter paints the cosmogony of himself.
Of himself. And it's as simple as that.
Exactly.
Which contemporary...
Raphael paints the cosmogony of Raphael. Raphael is the Renaissance period.
Yes.
Dali paints the atomic age and the Freudian age. Nuclear things and psychoanalytic things. Los pensadores y literatos no me pueden aportar absolutamente nada y los científicos todo, incluso la inmortalidad del alma.
I had the feeling Dali wanted to know what my mindset was. As I looked at the same objects he was looking, what kinds of questions was I asking, how was I using it?
It's obvious that Dali was influenced by science in many ways.
We always spoke pretty much as equals.
I think that the sound of science, the words and concepts used by scientists and the way they talked, it was like violin music to him.
November 1985. For a few days, the music of science filled the dome of the Dali Museum in Figueras. The Catalan painter hosted a highbrow scientific meeting at his museum. The event was organized by a young physicist from the University of Barcelona.
My first interview with him was a surprise because I hadn't expected a conversation with an artist to begin with questions like, "What are your latest discoveries?" or "What are you doing?" It's the kind of question that you would expect from a scientist. I realized straight away that he felt at home with the way scientists spoke.
The Figueras Congress dealt with the role of chance in nature. Among the speakers, all top-ranking researchers, were several Nobel Prize winners. Scientists, philosophers, and artists made up the audience.
The atmosphere was remarkable. Philosophers, musicians, writers, mingling with scientists. You felt that you could discuss things there that you would have found difficult to talk about in any other setting.
Dali wasn't present, but he was nearby. We knew he was watching everything over a closed-circuit TV, so we felt we were being closely observed.
Dali was 81. His health was too poor to let him take part in the Congress. He followed it from his bedroom on a TV monitor.
The basic reality is the geometrical element.
We paid him a visit about midway through the Congress. Dali had listened to several discussions and was very excited by what he had heard. And the scientists were fascinated by Dali. When greeting him, everyone tried to connect somehow with Dali's thought.
He wore a dressing gown, but still had an aristocratic air. He was very kind, but a little reserved at that meeting.
Prigogine took the opportunity to ask a key question.
Everyone thought it was more or less the case, but to everyone's surprise, Dali said, no, not at all. It is much more general than that. Of course, they were an allegory about time, and not specifically about the general theory of relativity.
Prigogine was a specialist in the study of time from a physics standpoint. After the Congress, he asked Dali again about the soft watches.
I wrote to him saying that I was very interested in the time aspects of his work and asked him if he had been influenced by Einstein.
It followed from the special theory of relativity that mass and energy are...
Prigogine was on the right track. Einstein and Freud had decisively influenced the young Dali. In the early 1920s, the Catalan artist was already displaying an interest in scientific writings. It became a lifelong passion. Einstein visited Spain in 1923 and gave a series of lectures on the theory of relativity. Spanish intellectuals, like those elsewhere, found it difficult to grasp his ideas, which had upset the fundamental concepts of physics since 1905.
Up until then, space had been thought of as a given, static thing. Newtonian space. It was a preconception, and it was deemed to be the same for everyone. Time was thought of in the same way. It was something that flowed regularly and that lay beyond our influence. And then Einstein came along and said, no, this is just not true. For example, time passes more slowly on the street than here on the first or second floor, where we are now. And this has been scientifically verified. Therefore, people on the street age more slowly than you and me. Of course, in this case, the difference over a lifetime only amounts to a few millionths of a second, so you can say it doesn't really make any difference. But the discovery that time and space have a dynamic of their own was an extraordinary revolution.
Dali was very excited by relativity theory because it seemed to offer to surrealism this notion that the real isn't simply reducible to a unitary temporal flow. Dali's most famous painting, The Persistence of Memory, has these kind of floppy watches, 3 watches in the image. So it suggests that different temporalities within the same frame are being expressed.
Surprisingly, Dali said that his soft watches were not inspired by relativity theory, but by the surrealist perception of a camembert cheese melting in the sun. The painter insisted on this explanation in his reply letter to Prigogine, who took it as Dali's reaction to Einstein's coldly mathematical theory.
With Einstein's theory, time doesn't have a direction. The future is essentially the same as the past. That's why he says that time is an illusion. But the melting cheese has a time direction. The cheese's past is not the same as its future. Objects are transformed in one direction. All things undergo change, not only in plants, animals or people, but also inanimate objects. Dali basically took up the idea once again of a universal time that lies within things. And I totally agree with Dali in that respect. Time is reality itself.
Es evidente que existen otros mundos. Esos otros mundos están en el nuestro. Residen en la Tierra y precisamente en el centro de la cúpula del Museo Dali, donde hay todo el nuevo mundo insospechado y alucinante del surrealismo.
The name Salvador Dali is inextricably linked to surrealism, one of the most influential art movements of the 20th century.
The First World War causes such chaos, such havoc. It's such a massive catastrophe. There's a feeling that there must be something more than this. There must be some way of transforming the way that we think and feel, and also transforming our view of the world through these 2 great new sciences that were developed by Freud on the one hand and by Einstein on the other.
Freud really comes to the fore as an inspiration, the source for Dali, once he is interested in joining the Surrealist movement.
Dali and the Surrealists are fascinated by the role played by dreams in Freud's theories.
Myself work constantly in the moment of sleep. Every of my best ideas coming through my dreams, and the more Dalinian activity consists in this moment of sleep.
With the mysterious force of the unconscious, the Surrealists set out to dynamite the very foundations of conventional bourgeois society.
They were challenging the value that is placed upon the rational, the pragmatic. If the unconscious, which is full of irrational forces and irrational fears and desires, is actually of permanent, continuous, daily importance, then we have to understand it. And what Breton says in the first Surrealist Manifesto is that we as poets have just as much right to do research and to do experiments in this field as the scholars and scientists do. And so he was setting up Surrealism itself, if you like, almost as a kind of pseudoscience, as a kind of arena for experiment.
Dali made a decisive contribution to the history of painting through his pictorial representation of the hidden world of the unconscious, first revealed by Freud.
Paintings like The Great Masturbator and Accommodations of Desire. These are, outrageous paintings. That they're wonderful, but they are extremely explicit about Dali's sexual anxieties. Yes, of course, they include symbols. Symbols of the kind that Freud explains to us in the interpretation of dreams.
Dali once wrote, "Freud is my father." In 1938, after several attempts to see him in Vienna, Dali managed to meet Freud in London, where the Viennese doctor had fled to escape the Nazis.
Allí hubo una escena terrible porque yo le enseñé mi cuadro La Metamorfosis de Narciso, que me gustó mucho, y dice, ahora comprendo cosas que no había comprendido de los realistas. Yo creía que eran unos borrachos, drogados, y ahora voy a tomar en consideración porque este cuadro es... Pero yo digo, el cuadro no me interesa, yo quisiera que usted leyera mi tesis sobre la paranoia crítica, y él volvía al cuadro. Yo volvía a que leyera mi tesis científica, y al final, puñetazo, digo, quiero que lea esta noche. Entonces Freud se quedó un poco asombrado y dijo a Stefan Zweig, nunca he visto un prototipo de español más claramente. Es un fanático. Esa es la palabra de Freud.
The paranoid critical method is Dali's main theoretical contribution to surrealism. He employed scientific discourse to explain the workings of his creativity. Paranoid criticism is expressed in his paintings in the form of double images.
When he was thinking about paranoia and using that term, he didn't understand it in the way that we tend to understand it now, as a kind of persecution complex. For Dali, paranoia was a form of delirium of interpretation.
Instead of ignoring his own hallucinations, ignoring his own fantasies that he experiences day by day, hour by hour, Dali fastens onto them. He gets hold of them. He wonders about them. He thinks about them. There's a greater acceptance of the value of hallucination in Dali.
In other words, he related it to a systematic misreading of objects in the world. The capacity to read into any one configuration something completely different. You have to interpret the painting either with one image or with another one. The association between those images, of course, can be revealing and, can give you some sort of notion of an unconscious preoccupation.
I mean, I wouldn't want to overemphasize Dali's interest in psychoanalysis, because when you look at his writings, and it's very important to look at the writings side by side with the paintings, because he's a prolific writer, well, that's when you start to wonder if his work is as motivated, is as driven by psychoanalytic themes as has been suggested. It seems to me that always in Dali's work there's a blending of lots of different discourses, if you like, around morphology and biology and physics and psychoanalysis. I wouldn't reduce his imagery simply to a psychoanalytic framework. I'd say it's an immense blending of a massive amount of reading.
Dali devoured scientific writings, especially those covering a new discipline that was revolutionizing the nature of physics. While the surrealists explored the unconscious, a new generation of scientists were going beyond tangible reality. Researchers like Schrödinger and Heisenberg studied matter at the atomic level and laid the foundations of quantum mechanics.
Heisenberg is famous for his uncertainty principle. This states that one can know a particle's position or speed, but not both. There are intermediate situations, but it is impossible to accurately measure both a particle's speed and position at the same time. The scientist's apparatus inevitably affects the observations made. Reality is determined by what the observer decides to observe. I think that is what really excited Dali. So, these scientists are telling me that my observations affect reality itself. I can obtain some information, but other information escapes me in the process. Where is that other data? But quantum mechanics tells us that certain information always slips through our fingers, no matter how hard we seek it. I imagine that realization must have greatly inspired Dali.
From a quantum mechanics standpoint, Dali's double images perfectly reflect Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. What one sees depends on the observer. In the same way as he had done with Freud, Dali assimilated a new scientific theory and reworked it visually.
The amazing thing about Dali in the 1930s is that he quotes Erwin Schrödinger. Dali actually quotes one of the most important quantum physicists of the time. I don't know of any other artist who was aware of Schrödinger's writings in the 1930s, let alone quoting them. It seems extraordinarily far-sighted.
Every of my paintings, everybody laughs in the moment of look for the first time, but almost after 12 years, every scientific people recognize that every of these paintings is one real prophecy.
I don't think Dali needed to understand things in the way scientists do. I believe he probably did not fully comprehend their ideas. But he was incredibly intuitive, and that is very important, both for scientists and for artists.
He didn't pretend to be a mathematician. I don't pretend to be an artist. But it's certainly clear that in interpreting mathematical forms, he was acting in many ways like a mathematician.
Great scientists and great artists want science and art to march hand in hand. It's an age-old dream which dates back to Pythagoras and the discovery that a musical note has a direct relationship with a number. The number is science, the sound is art. So you can see, the idea of a fusion between art and science dates back to Pythagoras.
(1934), Dali's first exhibition in New York. The painter felt at home in American society, whose boundless optimism for the future was based on faith in scientific and technological progress. Dali created a surrealist pavilion for the 1939 World Fair, but in reality, he was already parting ways with the movement. The surrealists accused him of becoming a showman and of trivializing his work. They ended up expelling him. A new stage was beginning in Dali's career.
Dali saw this sort of almost miraculous, but also, horrific event as being absolutely fundamental to the way that human beings thought about their future. So from the late 1940s onwards, you see a much greater interest in nuclear physics in Dali's painting.
The modern atomic age is very gay. Nothing is more gay than the collision and explosion of intra-atomic conflicts of nuclear physics.
You feel that really livens things up enormously.
For me, the more happy thing is these terrific conflicts about electrons and pi mesons and atoms. Is everything jumping and romping in a completely extraordinary eurythmic feeling.
Nuclear physics fascinated Dali because it opened up a mysterious world, a new dimension of reality and matter. In his paintings, all kinds of objects disintegrate into particles that float in space.
The galaxies, seen from a distance, are small specks floating in the vast emptiness of space. But the same is true of the microcosmos. In the microcosmos, the atoms that make up matter are sometimes close together and sometimes far apart, for example in a gas. When we look closer, we discover that atoms mainly consist of empty space. The electrons orbit a nucleus, which only makes up 100,000th of the atom. Once again, we find tiny fragments of matter floating in a vast vacuum. He realized that everything was made up of tiny pieces of energy and matter floating in space. And I think that is what he was trying to reflect in these pictures.
All your wonderful jokes that we know about taxi cabs with the rain inside and so on, you're going to go on with those jokes.
This corresponds to first period of my life. The moment of myself is very big interest in psychoanalysis, coming in London for meet with Dr. Freud. But now my interest is only about the tremendous progress of nuclear research and nuclear physics.
And so really that represented a phase in your career, those jokes that we all knew about, and now you move on and all your life will be to the rhythm of atomic explosion.
Exactly, one new kind of atomic and nuclear mysticism.
Well, thank you very much. That's a fascinating phrase, nuclear mysticism.
During the 1950s, Dali continued painting the fragmentation and atomic equilibrium of matter, but his work increasingly incorporated elements drawn from religion.
Within science, within Dali's own thinking, there is a fascination with the unseen world, you might say. It seems to be an issue to do with what lies beyond, what lies beneath, what is unseen. What can we not grasp? What is intangible? All of these issues seem to take in a certain notion of religiosity.
Creo en Dios, pero no tengo la fe. Por las matemáticas y por las ciencias particulares, sé que es indiscutible que Dios tiene que existir, pero no me lo creo.
He was a Catholic who never went to Mass. He took his inspiration from Thomas Aquinas and from Augustine.
Tim Phillips, the son of an American millionaire, was an aspiring young painter in the mid-1950s. Dali invited him to Portugal as an assistant.
I was a pupil, very much like the old masters had apprentices, and sometimes I'd make drawings, and other times I would actually paint in minor parts of canvases. It was a wonderful experience to paint on a canvas of such a great master.
Mr. Dali, who, apart from yourself, would you regard as a good portrait painter today?
Myself believe there does not exist one
Who?
in modern time.
Nobody at all. Have you ever seen...
Picasso is the only possible create extraordinary good portraits, may not like it, this kind of activity.
Dali used to say that he was painting Saviour, Salvador Dali, the saviour of painting. He wanted to continue the great tradition of European painting. And clearly, a key moment in European painting was the Italian Renaissance.
Like the old masters, Dali applied science to artistic composition. The Romanian mathematician and aristocrat Matila Ghica advised him on the use of the golden mean, a harmonious proportion known to the ancient Greeks, which is commonly found in nature. Gica's collaboration played a decisive role in some of the most important works of that period.
He actually thought that Gica had solved the problem of geometrical composition. For instance, here is this is a transcription of the Matthias C. Gica's golden section compositional diagram that Dali used all the time. Dali swore by Gica and used that diagram on practically everything.
I mean, some of Dali's most powerful images are, at first sight, religious images, but I think that they are actually closely related also to his continuing interest in physics. And I think this is something we have to understand in terms of the ambition both of physics and of religion to explain the world. Both are attempts to make sense of what remains a great mystery.
For Dali, there was first of all, there was a metaphysics that came from God. And then this metaphysics diversified into science and art, as so bifurcated.
Lo desgraciado de nuestros días es la monstruosa especialización de cada ciencia. O sea, el que sabe de física no sabe de pintura, el pintor no sabe de física, el biólogo muy poco de física. Todo está demasiado especializado.
He thought that the last great expositor of art and metaphysics was Leonardo da Vinci. And he thought that by an intense, paranoid, delirious, focused effort, he could bring them together again. And he did.
Some of the things that show up are very familiar to mathematicians who are geometers or even other parts of mathematics. When you see an image like that, it's clear that Dali is looking at it in a different way than the mathematician, but it's at the same time a new view, a new idea, and it can often make the mathematician go back and take a look at his or her work, or favorite images, and look at them in a new way. We'll just have a stylized waffle with one depression in it.
Thomas Banchoff is a specialist in the visual representation of objects of 4 or more dimensions and one of the pioneers in the field of computer-generated images. In 1975, his research was featured by the Washington Post. The article was illustrated with one of Dali's works.
Washington Post style section.
A few days later, Banchoff got a call from New York.
And I called up, and a woman answered and said, "Oh yes, Salvador Dali is in New York City. Senor Dali would like to meet you." So I said to my colleague, "What do you think?" And he said, "Well, it's either a hoax or a lawsuit, but the worst we can get out of it is a good story." When my colleague Charles Strauss and I got on the train to go to New York, I remember we talked about what we might expect, and we were really not sure what it would be like. We weren't sure whether we would see Dali alone. We haven't been given any real warning by the person who invited us to come down. Dali was more or less holding court at the St. Regis Hotel cocktail lounge. Various people would come in to see him, but we were the featured people at the time, the ambassadors from mathematics land. He was asking us questions immediately about some of the mechanical aspects of achieving the effects that he was looking for. At a certain stage, we began talking about the central object from his painting that had been featured on the cover of the Washington Post article. And it really was an unfolded polyhedral object. The object I have here is quite old, almost as old as my first visit with Dali, because I made it shortly after my visit. The object itself is an unfolded hypercube. And I was able to show him this object which we had designed. And he was quite taken with it. He liked to play with it, moving it back and forth, and asking questions about its construction.
In 1955, 20 years before his meeting with Thomas Banchoff, Dali had already painted an unfolded hypercube. The hypercube is a four-dimensional geometric object, but we live in a three-dimensional world, and we cannot imagine these kinds of objects. However, we can understand them through mathematical approximations. In the same way as 4 segments of a line can be folded to make a square, 6 squares can be folded to make a cube. To make a 4-dimensional cube, a hypercube, we would have to fold 8 3-dimensional cubes. Both the Christ figure and the hypercube are tangible representations of a higher dimension. Dali had achieved his dream of merging art, science, and religion.
The idea of Corpus Hypercube was to enlarge on the idea of St. John of the Cross. St. John of the Cross saw the crucifixion from the Father's aspect. Now, Dali wanted to project the idea of the sacrifice of Christ into the 4th dimension. In other words, to make it eternal.
The idea of unfolding the 4-dimensional cube into 3-dimensional space and seeing that as a representation of the crucifixion was Dali's genius. He saw it as an unfolding of the transcendental object into our ordinary world.
I think Dali was interested in science for several reasons. I think he was interested in it as, a highly intelligent, cultivated man who wanted to have the answers to certain aspects of our being in the world. I think he was also interested in the way in which science is also to do with the imagination. I mean, what are these great scientific theories, if not wonderfully imaginative ways of describing the unknown?
Landscape artists need to see natural light. That's why they go for walks in the countryside. But I firmly believe that Dali's remarkable creativity was nurtured by scientific knowledge.
He loved reading about scientific matters, and he certainly read a lot. I once took him a copy of Darcy Thompson's book on growth and form, and he said, "I've already got it." He had all of these books and had even spoken with their authors. He always wanted to keep abreast of scientific discoveries.
April 1953, a history-making article written by 2 young researchers is published in Nature. Watson and Crick will earn the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the structure of DNA. The double helix is published for the first time.
DNA contains all the information our cells need to produce proteins, which in turn allow the biochemical processes that constitute life itself. What they guessed is that this genetic code was the same for all living things: plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, everything. And that all life is basically the same. It was a major breakthrough which turned biology into a hard science.
Salvador Dali, a man like his paintings, most unusual, very interesting.
The only legitimate structure today is the molecular structure of desoxyribonucleic acid.
He was very excited about DNA. He not only grasped the idea, but also realized how important it was. He pushed the message home. Ladies and gentlemen, this scientific discovery is immensely important.
Creo que desde la primera molécula viviente hasta la última, la más excremencial, todo se transmite ineluctablemente genéticamente, según el famoso, la escalera aquella en espiral de Crick y Watson, el ácido desoxirribonucleico.
I think Dali's passion for DNA had something to do with the fact that Watson and Crick were very good at selling their ideas. If we had to name the 10 most important scientists of the 20th century, they would be among them. But Watson and Crick were also excellent communicators. They immediately wrote books. The Double Helix was not only fascinating, but also a good read. There was an element of public relations about the whole thing, something that scientists at the time did not engage in. But Watson and Crick were very good at it.
And then I met Salvador Dali in 1965. I had written a few chapters of my book, The Double Helix. And I had seen Dali's painting in Boston, Galactocytonucleic acid. A bank in Boston bought the painting, and it was in the newspapers. They bought the painting, and I went down and saw it. So I realized he had an interest in DNA, and I thought he could illustrate my book. So I was talking just jokingly with friends who lived in Sheridan Square in the Village in New York about Dali, and they said, well, he lives in the St. Regis Hotel. So we went to the hotel, and I sent him a letter, a short note, and it was something like, the second brightest man in the world wishes to meet the brightest. And he was down in 10 minutes. He came down from his room and he invited me to have lunch with him about a week later at the St. Regis Hotel.
The St. Regis was Dali's headquarters in New York.
The bar itself was set up as a stage for Dali. People would come up to him and he would speak to them in French or Spanish or Catalan. So it was really difficult to understand, but people didn't care. The effect was what was important. But when he was really serious, he talked to you in his room. He had specific questions to ask. He knew the background. He would ask the questions in a way that was quite understandable. If you were even confused at all, he would repeat, and he would ask you to repeat if you said something that he didn't get the first time. So the emphasis was on communication, whereas the emphasis for a lot of the people who visited him was showmanship.
Dali then had a very mixed reputation. He was an intelligent man, you know. But, you know, I mean, his comment, you know, the double helix proves the existence of God. So he took it one way. To me, it was just the opposite. The double helix, no need for God.
Dali did not illustrate Watson's book in the end. However, his fascination with DNA continued throughout the 1960s and 70s. His paintings during that period include many images that frequently appeared in the scientific journals of the time.
Depuis 30 années, je parle de ces merveilleux acides désoxyribonucléiques qu'à l'époque personne ne savait ce que ça voulait dire, et finalement, vous le voyez dans les pages les plus médiocres journaux, et le cancer que tout le monde était en train de le bafouer, aujourd'hui c'est celui qui va nous sauver probablement la vie à tous, et grâce au cancer, on arrivera à trouver l'immortalité.
Tell me this, what do you think will happen to you when you die?
Myself no believe in my death.
You will not die?
No believe in general in the death, but in the death of Dali, absolutely no, not. She believed in my death becoming very unfried is almost impossible.
You fear death?
Yes.
Death is beautiful, but you fear death.
Exactly. Because Dali is contradictory and paradoxical in anything.
Not even Dali could avoid the laws of biology. Gala died in 1982. Dali fell ill. He left his home in Portugal and set up in Pubol, where Gala had spent the last years of her life. His friend Tom Banchoff paid him a visit there.
In May of 1983, we came here to the castle in Pubol to show our films and new objects to Dali. The nurses brought him and made him comfortable in a chair right here. And after he was ready, we showed our first film, the Veronese surface. Dali was familiar with these images and aware of the fact that they look very different from very different points of view. As the object rotates in four-dimensional space, we see a number of situations that Dali very much appreciated. He would say that is marvelous when he would see something that approached a point of high visual ambiguity, which then resolved. Sometimes the object in the middle has three cusps. This is very important because Dali recognized that the three cusps showed that we were near an umbilic catastrophe that was studied by René Thom.
René Thom was one of Dali's long-standing friends. This French mathematician, winner of the Fields Medal, the equivalent of the Nobel Prize, developed a whole new branch of mathematics, catastrophe theory. The curves expressing Thom's equations appear in Dali's last paintings. Thom was one of the speakers at the Figueras Congress. The high point of the event came when he and Ilya Prigogine hotly debated their opposing views of the universe.
It was a critical point. Prigogine and Thom had exchanged shots in writing before, but had never met before.
So, am I right if I say that there is no logical connection at all between sensitive dependence on initial condition and time reversibility or irreversibility?
No, you are not right.
I'm not right?
No.
Then explain why.
Because, as I just have mentioned, I can only repeat what
They went for each other right from the beginning. Thom obviously knew more mathematics than Prigogine, but then Prigogine used mathematics a lot too. Thom argued that Prigogine was using maths in a clumsy, trivial way.
You should very carefully distinguish between what belongs to mathematical theory and what belongs to real systems. Mathematics has nothing to say to reality.
That is your point of view, it's not mine.
In any case, both Thom and Prigogine knew where they were. That's why they acted differently from the way they would have if they'd been in a more serious, scientific setting. I think they put on a bit of a show and were a bit more provocative.
No, not at all. What I'm saying...
Probably because they knew Dali was watching them.
It was the high point of the event. He turned round when I entered the room. He was very excited and said, "Now they're doing battle." He was enjoying himself because it was like seeing two trains crashing head-on.
What I do remember is that in the end, Dali told them not to quarrel. Anyway, he called them to his office after the debate, told them not to quarrel and to make up. That's what he did. He told them to make up.
The three-day Congress gave Dali renewed energy. The artist once again found the strength to make the world move around him. He summoned the two scientists to his room to give them a message.
Somebody came up to us, I think it was his secretary, and asked us to go up and see Dali. You could tell that he had been watching the debate. He more or less said, "I can see you don't agree, but I beg you to bury the hatchet in Schrödinger's name." I did not understand why he invoked Schrödinger.
Schrödinger is a very important figure in the development of quantum physics during the mid-1920s, and on the opposite wing, if you like, of quantum physics to Heisenberg. Heisenberg believed that it was impossible to recreate any kind of pictorial expression of reality on the deepest subatomic elemental level. Heisenberg refused to accept that. Schrödinger, on the other hand, thought that it would be possible to develop some kind of pictorial idea of how reality was behaving. Maybe that's the answer to that question, that as an artist, Dali felt that Schrödinger had some kind of... that there was something in Schrödinger's writings that he, as an artist, could respond to.
The part of the discussion space, a reference. Dali.
Me dicen que Salvador Dalí tiene grabada una despedida para todos nosotros.